Now we have that inhibitory response, which might cancel an excitatory one. And so these are different kind of ways of summation there. All right, so next, I'm going to briefly mention here a couple of particular types of neurotransmitters known to be either excitatory in green right here or inhibitory in red right here. And we just talked about that acetylcholine, right? These type of cholinergic, if you see the word cholinergic receptor, that's referring to acetylcholine. And your most common one, like in your muscles, is this so-called nicotinic receptor. Right? In fact, the agonist for this, the one that makes it more likely to fire, is nicotine, right? So that's why when you smoke, you kind of become a little, it's like a little bit of a speed effect. Right? So this is an agonist. We talked about this with the hormones, right? Things that make these more likely to fire, right? These nicotinic, they kind of promote this firing over here. And then the other one was that G protein coupled receptor, right? That we'll see in your effector cells of your peripheral nervous system. And those will be inhibitory ultimately because they'll open up the potassium channels. Potassium flows out. Again, you might go over this again when you get into heart stuff. And then there's these other ones which you may have heard of, like norepinephrine, adrenaline, dopamine, serotonin, right? So you may have heard things like, dopamine antagonists, right, for antipsychotic drugs, because dopamine is, highly associated with, schizophrenia and many other like psychoactive diseases. It's a dopamine. So an antagonist, something that kind of blocks dopamine. Dopamine action is really, really complicated. We won't get into it. And then the other major one, serotonin, right? Serotonin, a lot of psychoactive drugs are acting on these dopamine or serotonin receptors to kind of change the flow, the circuitry within your brain and make you feel weird, right? So those are those kind of ones you may have heard about, like serotonin, right? Or dopamine, adrenaline. Adrenaline is going to be more for when we get to our autonomic nervous system, we'll see that as a hormone. And then there's also the standard ones in your brain right there. Most of your excitatory neurons in your brain use glutamate as your neurotransmitter, binds to glutamate receptors. There's a couple ones that are really important in memory formation. You don't have to know this, but these NMDA receptors, if this glutamate receptor and the synapse is activated a whole bunch of times, this is how memory is formed, because you put more receptors in there, you make that cell more excitable. So this is glutamate, your main excitatory, and your main inhibitory one is your GABA receptor. GABA, a neurotransmitter, and the GABA receptor. Some potentiators, that is, you're increasing the effect of GABA, might be something like alcohol or barbiturates, right? They're kind of making you kind of slow down and relax and everything because they're increasing this GABA pathway neurons, right? In a very complicated way, but some of those are something that makes these receptors a little more active, more inhibitory toward any particular pathway. And then glycine we'll also see especially down your spinal cord and stuff, and it's another main inhibitory neuron, right? This is amino acids. So I have a list right here, a couple of small notes: acetylcholine, glutamate, GABA, glycine, norepinephrine. A couple of things to know: dopamine, right, is very active during addictive behaviors. This dopamine pleasure pathway over here, right? When you so-called dopamine hits, right? When you're doing something you like, or when you get a little like on your social media page or something that secretes a little dopamine, makes you want to do it again, right? And dopamine is, again, very complicated. It does all sorts of things. The other one I want to mention, that dopamine as well as adrenaline and stuff in your brain, in a very complicated way, the formation of it is from the amino acid tyrosine, but the breakdown of it is done by this enzyme MAO. And you may have heard of MAO inhibitors. They are a general class of antidepressants. right over there. So for some reason, you're stopping the breakdown of dopamine, and that makes you slightly less depressed. There's all sorts of weird side effects with these. I don't think they're used too much anymore, but just that's something you may run across, right? These MAO inhibitors, that would be preventing the breakdown of dopamine. The other one, which you may have heard of from serotonin. Serotonin, again, is in everything and modifying things like your perception, control of mood, appetite, induction of sleep. It's amazing kind of neurochemical, and is also the target, as I said, of very psychedelic drugs like LSD, as well as antidepressants and anti-anxiety medicine. So way back when I talked about the fact that neurotransmitter is released into the synaptic cleft over here and has to be cleared, right, by being brought up. If for some reason, and this could be genetic, it could be environmental, it could be training or something, you don't have enough serotonin, which when you don't have enough serotonin, you feel kind of bad, right? There's wrong things happening. So what these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors do is they act on certain uptake channels and they block it, right? So the serotonin stays in the synaptic cleft and it continues to activate that whatever circuit serotonin's involved in, and hopefully make people feel like less anxious or less depressed and stuff like that. So that's a lot of your drugs and stuff are working on these kind of pathways, on these synaptic pathways, maybe activating the receptors or maybe doing something like that reuptake inhibitor, leaving it more in there. All right, so those are just a couple of those that come up quite often. Mostly acetylcholine, glutamate, GABA, norepinephrine we'll talk about a little bit. We may talk about dopamine. This was just sort of common clinical type of stuff. And serotonin is a huge one for mood and everything like that, right? All right, so the last subject I'm going to talk about here is is the more complicated part in a way. Again, it's very hard to understand why all this bouncing around in your brain right now is giving rise to perception and mood and feelings and stuff like that. Everything that you are consciously aware of is due to all these neural circuits bouncing around over here, right? So there's a couple different ways, these so-called neural circuits, they're going to be passing on information, right? Number one, we kind of saw this with the neuromuscular junction. We saw a motor neuron that was branching off and innervating like 1,000 or 100 muscle fibers, right? Branching off. In this case, this one's branching off and it's innervating these two guys. It's talking to these two guys who are go on and to talk to these, right? This is called a diverging circuit. And this is a way to pass on information from this one all the way down somewhere else eventually. And again, always remember that, this one over here, this is both going to be an excitatory input if it's an excitatory neuron, right? So you're going to excite these, but this one might be, this cell might be inhibitory neuron, and this one might be an excitatory, right? So the effects from this one input could be very different on these two populations right here. And the same thing for over here, right? This one could be excitatory, this one could be excitatory, and this one can be inhibitory, right? So this is all that summation thing we were talking about, a converging, all these this one cell is getting all this input, which is what's happening in all your brain, right? Then there's other ones which are going to give feedback, right, to this whole pathway. This again gets very complicated, right? You have an input, it's exciting this one, right, which goes and excites this one. When this one is excited, it passes that information not only onto this one, but onto this one. And if this one was, say, negative, this was an inhibitory one, right? The fact that it's passing on the signal right here is going to repress this one and this one. And so it's going to slow down the circuit. So the more this one gets activated, the more these are inhibited, which again seems kind of weird, right? Or maybe this one over here, if it does get through, then this one is also inhibitory, and it inhibits this one from inhibiting these. You can see how complicated this can get very quick, but this is a so-called reverberating, right? It's giving that feedback from this original signal back onto itself. And then this one, I'm not even going to try to explain, but this is really what's going on all over the brain, these parallel circuits going on such that you're activating many different kinds of pathways at once that may involve the output. And again, it wouldn't make any sense unless you knew that some of these were excitatory, some were inhibitory, and they're having all sorts of input from other types of cells, right? All at once right here. So very, very complicated stuff, and nothing that I could ever explain to you in this type of class, or really probably any type of class, because it's not really well understood. But that is just a brief thing about neural circuits. And I think that will do it for this lecture.